Hi, my name is Nejahla Hopkins, and I have conducted my undergraduate research on 19th century blackface minstrelsy and also its effect on modern day media and modern media representations of African Americans. For this research, the ultimate objective was to kind of understand how American popular culture is still living in a 19th century minstrelsy era just without the burnt cork, and understanding how our media reality and physically reality kind of collides based on those 19th century imaginative idealization of those minstrel performers back in 1832. So without further ado, let's get started. So to start, for this research, I decided to conduct a survey to understand individuals' awareness of minstrelsy and minstrel shows to begin with, and also blackface. What interesting is I did a survey studying 18 to 55-year-olds, and in this came out that 58.8% of individuals 18 to 46 plus, roughly 55, have never heard of a minstrel show. However, 76.5 of those same individuals have seen or heard of blackface through modern day media such as TV, social media, Halloween parties, friends, old pictures. So this kind of ultimately just shows that minstrelsy is still around. We just don't know that it's minstrelsy. So in understanding minstrelsy, we did a deep dive into basically historical text articles in order to understand what is minstrelsy. So minstrelsy is defined by Eric Flott as an established 19th century theatrical practice in which white men caricatured blacks for sport and profit. And this, they just imitated, embodied, taken on the black body to kind of come into their inner blackness, which actually leads to my research question of how has minstrelsy concepts been applied to our modern day media entertainment, affecting the representations of African Americans based off of this specific concept and era. So to answer this question, we broke minstrelsy down and analyzing it era by era. And the first era is the early antebellum minstrelsy period of 1830s to the 1840s, where in 1832, Thomas Wright observed a disabled African American man jumping about in the street or a sidewalk, singing Jump About Jim Crow. He thought it was very comedic, so he blackened his face, imitated his movements, and took the performance to stage, and it became an overnight sensation. After that, minstrel shows began popping up everywhere, where now then white performers would cover their faces with black grease paint to take on the black complexion. They would wear raggedy clothing to embody that slave image, and they adopted the heavy African American dialect to channel their inner blackness to perform comically through propaganda and economic and social conditions of slaves. And ultimately, this led to the evolution of minstrelsy throughout American entertainment as the vehicle for comedic racial stereotypes and framing the body as black entertainment. After America shifted out of the antebellum period, we enter into the 1850s and the 1860s, which was a big time for the abolitionist movement. And in this era, minstrelsy relied heavily on propaganda in order to serve as a social advocate tool for white Americans to establish that social identity, the mobility above African Americans, and also to justify why African Americans should remain in this bondage, idealizing the form of the good old days, which was represented in the early antebellum period. This was done through songs like "Oh, I So Wicked" to kind of attack the African American existence and create those negative perceptions as they're lazy or uneducated and dangerous and inferior, and kind of ultimately reflected whites' ideal society to validate their superiority above African Americans. However, the South lost the Civil War and slaves were free. This also took place of the Third Great Migration for African Americans between the South and the North, and which led to also the urbanization of the integration of the stage between the 1870s and 1890s. And in this period of minstrelsy, it relied heavily on that new stance of representation of the black body in white America. And it cultivated the new Negro image, separating it from the slave image to these new representation of like the coon or Uncle Tom, the dangerous bad buck, which was kind of established in the Civil War, Mammy and the tragic mulatto and the buddy sidekick. And African Americans that did want to go into showbiz had to live up to these stereotypes. They had to portray these if they wanted to be in showbiz. And performers like Burt Williams and George Walker, who also created African American minstrels as well, lived up to these stereotypes, and this allowed for the black body to actually become the form of entertainment that started with white individuals taking on that inner blackness. But in this, black individuals who did want to participate in minstrel shows kind of created their own new Negro image as they tried to steer away from these negative stereotypes and emphasize religion and family and music while still having that comedic foundation in there. And what's funny is that while white minstrel shows, they made fun of or mocked or mimicked black or African Americans, so did black minstrel shows as they mimicked white Americans, specifically creating the dance craze, the cakewalk, that imitated the white master's walk, and it became a craze sensation overnight. And then after this, white minstrel creators started to see that black people had this profitability gain in them and started to really use them as this form of entertainment, leading to show business. So as we enter into the 1900s and the 1960s, minstrel shows go off scene, and blackface films and black television shows and show business kind of comes on screen, and this solely shifts from on stage to on screen framing and socially constructing reality through show business. It switches from that propaganda standpoint to framing, physically turning black people into real life amusement, such as Birth of a Nation, which set the agenda to frame African American as a danger to society and glorify the KKK, which actually also altered and influenced reality as it kind of glorified the second birthing of the second Ku Klux Klan. And they also, a majority of performers were like in blackface, but there were some African Americans on screen in that movie as well. Old Kentucky and I Ain't Gonna Open That Door starred the first black actor, Lincoln Perry, and it kind of used the black body as that entertainment, but framing him as the laziest man in the world. But he was the first black actor to earn $1 million, and this ultimately shows like what African Americans were awarded for, and what deemed their success, you know. So these derogatory roles deemed success for Lincoln Perry. Also, even Amos and Andy, it started off as a radio minstrel show being performed by two white radio personalities, portraying two black men, but then led on to TV using black actors, really taking that standing role in black sitcoms. It really led the vehicle to creating that amusement of the black body. And into that, it led into the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s of primetime ghetto. Mid to late 20th century primetime ghetto. So you had shows popping up like Good Times and Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and What's Happening and The Jeffersons. And these really utilized African Americans as entertainment. They started to pop up more and more. And while breaking airwaves and allowing for black people to get their big break in acting, they still had to succumb to those racial stereotypes. So the mammy, like Gone with the Wind, early 1930s, and Good Times, JJ, a lot of people say he's the coon character. Same thing with Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. These black actors can be compared to those white minstrel performers who blacken their face on stage, to those black actors being in front of the camera, and those directors that were behind the scenes, behind the stage, pulling the curtains, are the same ones that are behind the camera telling these people what and how they can act in. And this, because these sitcoms were a lot, very broad span on TV, it brought these black sitcoms into white households, Hispanic households, even Asian households. It brought them into a lot of households on a broad demographic. And this led to blackface parties on college campuses like Soul Review that happened at Georgia State University in the 60s by the Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity, imitating people like the Temptations or the Four Tops. And then as hip hop emerged in the 80s, in the 90s, Party in the Projects happened by the same fraternity at Texas Tech University. So it's kind of, we see that continuance of minstrelsy and the form of the minstrel show going away, but blackface still around, and the concepts of those framing and propaganda still around. And in this, we see today the same representations. We still see misrepresentations of African Americans in the mass media, and it still continues to linger. And it still continues to affect a lot of what goes on in today. So you see in the news media, you'll see a lot of Black Lives Matter protests circulated into a riot, you know, and sometimes it could be peaceful protests, but with the help of social media, you're able to see both perspectives. But if you only watch news media, you're only going to see that one perspective, which is the same thing that happened during the Civil War with minstrel shows and in that area. But then you have Black philanthropists who try and actually show the true African American story as those same Black minstrel performers did in the late 1890s, giving these Black performers a way to voice who they are, whether that's musicians, authors, actors. It gained weight. However, what isn't appealing to the masses, or what doesn't sell, is condemned or it's stolen by white media creators, and even influencers like Kim Kardashian. Box braids have been around forever, but then they've been condemned forever up until Kim Kardashian did it. So in that, it just shows that this minstrelsy effect has still happened. Even when you see this Aunt Jemima advertisement on the left, that's the original Aunt Jemima, well, close to the original Aunt Jemima, but on the right you see a prettier face, but it's still on that mammy image. So it's just like this minstrelsy, and this on the left, it was created in 1925. On the right, it was created in I think around 1980, 85, and it's still here today. Well, was until they rebranded this past year. But as you see, the Black image has been cultivated by white Americans, and it's been what's deemed successful by white Americans as it was in the 1830s. And in this, how has this ultimately affected African Americans to begin with? For this specific research, I conducted a focus group to understand how are these media representations affecting African Americans personally. And from this focus group, one answer that specifically stood out was the following: there is not enough Black representation in the media today. When this topic is brought up to those responsible, they throw in a random Black person to appease the public. Growing up was worse. On TV, there was only a few shows with strong African American representations, and when a movie came out, the Black guy was always the villain or comedic relief. This emotionally impacted me because there was not enough accurate or positive representation of Black people that I could look up to. In this, it shows that the media still plays on these ongoing stereotypes that African Americans really can't get rid of. It's kind of stamped on our backs, and we don't have these strong representations to look up to, because every time we look at the media, we're always seen as the villain or comedic coon that you can really never take seriously, showing that these stereotypes still ongoingly affects us. So in conclusion, minstrelsy has never left our society. It's continued its transformation through the advancement of American entertainment, cultural society, and mass media. It's continued to wreak havoc by disguising itself without the burnt cork, by using Black people as the entertainment figure, and continuing that racist sentiment in American entertainment was built on through those stereotypings. And it also just, American media continues that tradition of propaganda, framing, and stereotyping by telling the masses how to view African Americans. So overall, concluding, minstrelsy has carried along the 19th century narrative since 1832, and it's continued to do so for the last 189 years. In new forms, new ideas, in unconscious conformed ways from those in front and behind the camera. So it's Now, how do we move past it is the next ultimate question.